Welcome to the first episode of the Well-Known Podcast, where we will parse claims, share signals, post events, and much, much more. We'll be talking to experts and exploring issues in and around the identity industry. I'm Elizabeth Garber. For the birth of this podcast, we are going to talk about death, specifically the new white paper, The Unfinished Digital Estate, which you can read on the OpenID Foundation website. My guests are Dean H. Sachs, Heather Flanagan, and Mike Kaiser. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us,
Elizabeth.
If you want to go around the table and introduce yourselves, we'd love to hear a little bit about you and how you got involved in this community group.
Okay, so I'm Dean Sachs. I've been a security engineer and identity person for a long time now, and the whole long history of how I got involved in this idea of digital estate and managing your digital estate after death that brought us to the point of starting the Death and Digital Estate Community Group about a year ago. Once we started that group, we realized there was no work, at least accessible to us, that we could easily read and digest that shared the idea that we have these digital estates and we need to be able to manage them, and we're lacking the tools digitally to manage them. We're lacking the cultural competency to know how cultures want to handle digital estates, how it may differ across different parts of the world and different cultural traditions. There was no one advocating really for this. And so over a couple of discussions, and then finally one afternoon having lunch at IIW down in California earlier this year, Heather and Mike and I put together a proposal for a white paper to cover exactly these topics. And I couldn't be happier to have better editors with me than Mike and Heather. They've been fantastic partners on this journey.
It's a pretty fierce team. Heather, why don't you go next?
Sure. I mean, for me, it was one of the things that I really enjoy doing is helping make words happen, and happen in a coherent, logical order that suddenly explains a wealth of different concepts to as many people as we possibly can get. And this is a set of conversations that I think desperately need to be held, and that people, they don't even know what questions they should be asking. I mean, if you ask my mom or my sisters or any of my non-technical friends and colleagues, well, what do you do? It's like, oh, well, I'll just make sure they have my password. And at which point, you just start to cringe a little bit, because there is so much more than that that needs to be considered. And it doesn't work in a typical, U.S. Western culture. It doesn't work globally. It's something that doesn't work. And so I was really happy to have the opportunity to dive into what's needed, how it will look different in different cultures, and what work is already underway.
Thank you. Mike, now it's your turn.
I'm Mike Kaiser, Director of Strategy and Standards at SailPoint. When I got involved, there were a series of events, both in my work friendships and my personal friendships, where people passed away quite suddenly and were not particularly prepared to, prepared to do that, obviously, but they hadn't prepared their estates or their loved ones to be able to take over afterwards. And I think those incidents really drove all of us to kind of realize, oh, this is a very, very prominent, ubiquitous problem, right? It's rare to hit a use case where everybody's going to go through this use case at some point or another. It's also really unusual to find something that is technical in a lot of ways, touches everyone, is not hard to explain. Single sign-on, passkey, all these other things have some on-ramp to explain what's going on. This does not. Are you human? Would be the first question. And yes, well, this is a use case for you, right? So combining all of that, is there's something very powerful about that you're not just trying to think about the problem space and define it and see what potential technical or policy or whatever other solutions there might be, but also providing real help to anybody and everybody that you know, right? The conversations that I've had always start with, what are you doing? And so I do standards. And like, what does that mean? I'm like, that's a great question. And this is the one I lead with because they get it immediately. No one says, well, that's pointless. They say, yeah, how can I read your paper? And I'm like, yeah, once we have it, once we have ideas and solidify it. And then I have these really deep, meaningful conversations with people, which is my other part of my life, right? I've got a technical part of my life, and then I've got a theological, philosophical part, and that combining those two, like it all just blends in really well. And so I just find the whole process exciting because you're making a real impact and actually using the background and the information that we all have, the expertise we all have to kind of help meet people's needs.
It's really wonderful when we can feel that sense of, delivering something that means something to everyone, that we can talk to people in our lives about who are not already involved in standards. It's nice when that happens. So, Dean, you were really the driving force of how this community group came together. You've been at least
Sure.
thinking about it for many years. Do you want to tell us, double click on the story of how the community group got started, and
Yeah.
why OpenID Foundation was the right home for it?
Wow. Sure. So how all of this came to pass was about 15 years ago now. A good friend of mine, Roman, we had worked together. We had traveled around the world together as consultants working for Foundstone Professional Services in the latter part of the 2000s. He passed away quite suddenly. He was young. He had a wife and kids, and being a security person, his digital assets were well secured, to the point where it made it very difficult for his widow to get access to that data. That event started me thinking about this problem space and thinking about how do we deal with this challenge of all of the digital stuff that we have. And this was, around 2010. And so we were seeing the rise of Facebook. It was sort of early days of Twitter, but really social media was taking off at this point, and a lot more people were putting lots of their data online. And immediately I thought, a dead man switch is a great idea. Terrible name, but perfect idea, because you could set something up where if you don't check in every so often, then those credentials might be released to whoever you wish to release them to. So your partner, your kids, whatever it might be. Um, but we weren't using password managers at the time. I mean, some of us were, because we're nerds, but most of the world wasn't. And even back a year or so ago, I believe it was Dashlane or Bitwarden maybe, that did a survey that showed in 2023, 2024 timeframe that only about 35% of Americans were still using password managers. However, I also saw the rise of passkeys. I was involved in the FIDO Alliance, and when synchronized passkeys were starting to be talked about and really starting to talk about them publicly around 2022, had a conversation with Vittorio Bertocci and Tim Capali and Andrew Shikyar from the FIDO Alliance and Khaled Zaki, who was my colleague at Amazon, one night at EIC in Berlin, about this idea of a dead man switch and having some way to release those credentials now that we're going to force more and more people into using some sort of a credential manager with passkeys. So the opportunity was now there, and we talked about it. And Tim called it Dean's Death Service, and started referring to DDS for the rest of the week. And of course, we all went on and forgot about it because there were other things going on. There was more interesting problems, or more pressing problems, so to speak, to work on. In 2023, of course, a friend of ours and an industry icon, Vittorio Bertocci, passed away. And when he passed away shortly thereafter at IAW, I spoke about this idea of the dead man switch. I talked about it with Heather and others at Authenticate in October of 2023. And that really kind of kicked things off, and led to writing a proposal for Identiverse in 2024, where Mike Kaiser, Eve Mailer, and Kalia Young and I did a panel presentation on what we then just called Death in the Digital Estate. We didn't have a community group. And that led to writing the charter. And the charter was adopted by the foundation about a year ago. Right now, I believe it was September of last year, 2024. And that led to founding the group, and then onward to the white paper and the other work that's going on.
Thank you. And we're so grateful that you picked OpenID Foundation as a home for this really important work.
Well, it's kind of a natural fit, right? I mean, it was the place where a lot of interesting work was happening around things like EKYC. And of course, you've got the protocol work for verifiable credentials, which I think has a real utility in this space of dealing with death and credentials around death and how you might transition some credentials to. Or issue credentials to a decedent's chosen people to be able to allow them to manage those
Mhm.
accounts. So it was kind of a natural fit. And of course, Gail was super welcoming when we talked about it and was happy to help me in writing the charter and bring things to the foundation to get the work kicked off.
So you've talked a little bit about passkeys in relation to this paper. All of you are major contributors to the standards world. Did you as you were writing it, did you see other alignments to other standards that are emerging or things you've been working on in other work groups? All of you can answer this, although preferably not at the same time. Heather, you look
I
like you're
will
about
s-
to
Mhm.
speak.
I will say my observation is this is still not an area that's really touched on directly.
Mhm.
There's certainly indirect conversations, and I would say that the most obvious one is in the form of delegation. Delegation is an incredibly difficult problem to solve. We have not solved it yet. In fact, I don't think we, as humans, have ever solved it. From wax seals and carrying around a ring to today of, okay, can you actually delegate authority? You can do kind of one hop. You can tell the app, yes, you can act on my behalf to do the thing, but it's very, very restricted. Anything further than that to actually delegate to another person outside of a real time event or to chain that delegation to say, okay, I can delegate to that person who then in turn can delegate some aspect of that to another person, to another person, to an AI, who knows. All of that work will have direct relevance on death in the digital estate, but it's still kind of a glint in our eye more than anything else.
I see.
I mean, I think, ancient Egypt, surely they had some kind of
Oh,
offline
yes,
delegation, right? So I think it's
yes.
more the digital aspect, right? Wouldn't you say that
No,
we're catching up to?
I'm gonna assert that yes, you have it, but I
Yeah,
mean, how useful is it when it's a physical ring that can be stolen easily enough, carried around? If someone doesn't recognize
It's a doors open.
what it's a bear token, what that ring should even look like. If I come and I show up some way and say this is the ring of the monarch of Utopia. Okay, what is Utopia? Who's the monarch? Why do I care? This is stuff that's been
sure,
going on for
sure,
eons.
sure.
Yeah, you need
But
all
within
that
a,
metadata.
yeah, within a framework is all I'm saying. I think that the anonymity. Did you want a discussion, Elizabeth? Because you got a discussion. The
I'm into this.
the anonymity of the online world, I think, lends itself to specially defined issues and problems that didn't necessarily exist. To the point, in the ancient world, who are you? Here's my document signed by some authority that someone recognizes. Fine. If you don't have that, then you're an outsider, and the whole thing is pointless anyway. So either that proves your point or disproves your point. But I see I see people not wrapping their heads around the fact that their life continues in digital format after they're gone. And I
I think
think
that
as a
is the key.
society, so Heather and I will obviously continue this discussion later on. I can see from her face,
Can see
There
it.
will be
but
alcohol involved. I have no doubt.
But I think, Mike, what
uh,
you just said about living on after you have physically stopped living is key here. And this is especially true with what's happening in the realm of AI and the ability to create deep fakes or create videos. I saw a thing, Ozzy Osbourne recently passed away, and I saw a thing where he was turned into an AI avatar and showed up at someone else's funeral. And I was like, this is the weirdest timeline ever. I hate this timeline. I don't want this. But I think as technologists are thinking about these AI tools, we need to not only think about how they can be used for good, but how they can actually harm people. And on one of the Death and Digital Estate calls recently, we actually talked about a study that was done. I want to say it was out of the UK. I don't remember, but we can find it in the notes if we need to. Um, about the harms of grief bots, for instance. So if you have put
Mm.
together an AI grief bot for your family ahead of your passing, um, how does that impact your kids, your partner, your others that you interact with, who then may become dependent upon that thing, or may find it odd and strange and weird and cause its own sort of harms in the way in which people then interact with this virtualized version of yourself.
Hmm.
All of it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Um, and to that end, I think it's really important we give people choice, and we give people real choice, not the click here to consent to cookies kind of forced choice that isn't really a choice at all, but actually give people the ability to make real choices about how they wish their name, their likeness, their image, their voice, to be reused and remixed, especially after they're dead.
So, do you want to take us through some of the key findings and recommendations in the paper to that end?
Um, sure, I can walk through some of them.
Or
You know,
headlines?
so each of the three of us sort of worked on different aspects of the paper. I worked on a lot of the technology oriented aspects. Heather did really deep research into existing law and structures, and Mike hit a lot of the cultural highlights. And I think probably each of us can hit on one of those. Um, from my perspective, from the standards space, and Heather, Mike, I invite you to join in here too, because I know you have feelings on this. Uh, we need to be advocating for standards around how we communicate that our physical being has died, and now something needs to happen with our digital assets. Now that something could be handled via what George Fletcher likes to call benevolent impersonation, which is, well, I've got access to your credential manager, so I can use your passkey and log into Google, and then I can do all the things and unwind your accounts. That's actually not generally legal. I am not a lawyer, so don't take any of this as legal advice, but generally speaking, that would be outside of the bounds of the law. However, it is something that some providers, I believe Yahoo being one of them, actually expect you to do in order to unwind somebody's digital assets when they die. On the other hand, Google, Apple, others provide mechanisms to assign a legacy contact, and that legacy contact has access to some or all of your digital assets that are held by that particular provider. But there's a clear inconsistency here, and the benevolent impersonation, kind of like Heather said, give your password to somebody and let them then manage your digital assets. That can result in actual harms, because what if that password is used before you pass away? What if that person uses that account to then post something inflammatory under your name, especially after you've died? And we've seen this happen. There was a politician, an American politician, who months after he died endorsed somebody else in another race, and it was somebody on his staff who did it through Twitter. But these are real harms that can be caused through this. So we need to define tools. We need to define tools to establish whether somebody has actually died, and like as some sort of a framework around how trustworthy is the data that so and so has passed away, who then gets access to their digital assets, how do they gain new credentials to get access to those assets, and what kind of permissions do we need to put around that. And I think when we talk about permissions, when we talk about authorization, the critical thing to keep in mind is we cannot build a standard universal permission system for all of your digital assets. There are too many different ways that different services and systems have done this, and we shouldn't try. But what we should do is we should try to connect the owner of the account with a set of permissions that they can grant to their digital estate managers or legacy contacts, whatever we want to call them, and a way to connect those legacy contacts with those accounts after the owner has passed away, so that they can take action under the rules that were set up by the account owner. And that, I think, is the ultimate goal from a standardization perspective of what we can aim to get to, in a way that protects privacy and minimizes individual harms as much as possible.
Heather, Mike, do you want to take us through any of the key findings on your parts of the paper?
So as Dee mentioned, one of the things that I've done in the past in this paper was try and take that broader global view. I tend to be a globalist in what I do, in thinking about, okay, the standard has to work all over the planet in all the different regulatory regimes that the planet has. And therefore, I can't necessarily assume that there are things like, oh, I don't know, death certificates, and that they are issued the same way across the world. A friend of mine passed away recently, which is when I discovered that it takes 10 to 12 business days for a death certificate to actually be issued. In today's digital world, that's a really long time, really long time. But the bank account doesn't close until the death certificate is issued. The credit cards don't. I mean, the whole financial sector has their processes for what happened. Outside of that, you have to carry the certificate with you, to actually give to a service provider to say, no, really, the person has died. All of this takes so long. And different countries are very much handling it differently. What we highlighted in the paper, looked at the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, India, the EU, South Africa, Nigeria, Tanzania. It's all different wherever you go. And that has some other interesting implications when you come back to the melting pot that the US has been in the past. They bring all of that with them, the expectations and what happens when I have to tell my relatives back home in Italy, in the EU, or in Nigeria, or in Ethiopia, or in South America, right? The expectations, the what happens, the legal frameworks behind it, right now, it's pretty much a mess.
Mike, anything you can add?
Yeah, it's all intertwined, right? Dean's talking about some of the standards work and the technical aspects and what would be needed, and Heather's saying, the legal frameworks that exist are disparate and complicated and regionally located, so that you can't really make assumptions, as we often do, that things work like wherever we live or we come from. I think what struck me in the section I was working on is all of that kind of comes back down to what the culture thinks of death and how it expresses those values through law and through technology. In other words, different cultures having different reactions have implications. The West, for instance, often where I live in the States, people don't really like to talk about death because it's not a happy topic, and they just kind of avoid it and act like it doesn't exist. That's very different than other cultures, like some in the East, where they have, in Japan, they have birthdays at set intervals to celebrate and kind of um, guide people through the process of getting older, of aging, and preparing for the next transition. To say nothing of what a culture believes in terms of, does someone continue to exist in some form or being after death? That has implications on the rules and the laws you make. Are you making them for the survivors? Are you making for the deceased? And that all of that is really, really fascinating, even as an application developer or provider. If I'm not thinking about this topic or talking about it, then I'm much less likely to put that feature or functionality in, because I'd rather not talk about it in the first place. And so it's fascinating how all these things kind of interleave and address the technical aspect and the legal aspect. And ultimately, I think some of what we've all done is also realize, in my opinion, realize that the legal environment often is the linchpin for driving adoption of things,
Yeah.
especially in a situation like this where it's not exactly, I'm probably not going to choose an email provider depending on who is set up the best to hand off to my partner, per se. That might change, but that's usually it's what looks coolest to me, right? And so that's an interesting dynamic as well.
So, as a result of the paper as it stands now, are you recommending any new technical standards be developed or families of standards? And can you expect them to be globally adopted in the context of different fundamental philosophies?
Such a great question. Yes. So broadly, we are recommending new standards be developed. We don't know what they look like exactly. And the Death and Digital Estate Community Group is not currently chartered as a community group. It's not currently chartered to develop any standards whatsoever. So things need to happen in order to get there. And the thing that needs to happen is we need to found another working group with a focus on developing standards in this space. Now, there are things happening currently, say, in the EKYC working group around delegated authorization. Now, that is clearly impactful to the work that we're going to do within Death and Digital Estate. And so supporting that and want to see that continue forward, keep working with those folks to work through those use cases, develop those use cases, develop the mechanisms, the standardized mechanisms to be able to express those use cases. I think that's fantastic, and I'm happy to see that happening. The more complicated side, I think, is really to figure out how do you connect service providers, and I'll call some out here, and I'm calling them out by name just because they're common, not for any other reason, but Apple, Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. How do you connect the service providers with a service that allows an individual to decide who their estate managers are and what access they'll have? So, for instance, the three of us on this call here, I may use a service, for instance, to say, I want to give access to Elizabeth to my account at AOL. I don't really have an account at AOL, and nobody would want it if I did.
I want it.
You want it? Okay. All right, cool. I'll talk to George. He probably has some inside scoop over there still. And Heather is going to get my Blue Sky account because, of course, that's the thing that she really wants. And Mike is going to get access to everything else. Well, that's great, but how do I need to go to each individual provider and say who these people are, and then keep those providers up to date, and then have the three of you as individuals provide a death certificate to each provider in order to say, and now I'm going to take ownership of this thing? That seems really hard. So what we really need is more like a centralized clearinghouse or a service where I can basically identify the three of you as part of my digital estate managers and get a credential that I can provide to, say, Google or AOL or Apple or whomever, and say, this service manages my digital estate managers, and we'll connect you with all those people when the time is right, so that I can protect your identities. You aren't connected to those accounts today. You don't have credentials for those accounts today, so you can't abuse them. And I can, upon my death, somebody has a death certificate, presents it to the estate service, which then can issue credentials to the three of you, which can then be cashed in at the target services that you want to access to be able to retrieve my digital assets, and under whatever authorization I've given to each of those services. It's an idea. It's not necessarily the right idea or the best idea, but it's an idea, and it's a place to start. And I think that's kind of where we need to start, because it allows individuals the autonomy to decide who they wish to assign ownership of or management over different parts of the digital estate. It gives the service providers the ability to manage the authorization controls they need in place, and the rules, and it offloads that responsibility to validate that a person has actually died or become incapacitated or whatever the rule is that is triggering this state change to issue these new credentials. That has to happen outside of all these service providers, because we can't expect every single service provider to do it identically.
So
Heather clearly has something to say.
I do. Once upon a time, long ago, my entire job consisted of answering the question, what could possibly go wrong?
Just in random contexts, in all possible contexts, or
I was working it was the .com era, and so I was like the lead sysadmin for a bit, and literally my job was, what could go wrong? What can go wrong with the systems? What can go wrong with the service? Are we in the flight path of the airport? What happens if we die in a fiery plane crash? All of it was literally part of my job. What could possibly go wrong? And the death and the digital estate work has to have that consideration as well. Because, we are talking about having these services and making sure that okay, so maybe there's a death certificate, making sure that they reflect what the person wanted, but there are ways that they can be abused, and that's something that we have to take into account as well.
Mm-hmm.
I had a really fun conversation with someone who pointed to a group that we don't often think about when we're talking about identity and related standards, and that's the notaries. Notaries can have a really interesting role in this because their job isn't just to verify, yes, Mike Kaiser, and this is his signature, and he showed me his ID. They're also required to make sure, does he appear to be under duress? Is he not only of sound mind to do this, but is he doing it under duress, yes or no? And that could be a really interesting component to include in all of this. So in the situation of maybe it's a domestic abuse situation and someone is being required to sign things that they shouldn't be signing, the notary actually is that gatekeeper that we could consider as a role in the digital estate moving forward.
I think
Yeah.
notaries is such an interesting case. I in my work on unhoused populations and those lacking identity documents, the role of the notary is obviously pivotal. And I just wonder how many ways in which we could bring that role into some of these use cases that we study in our work.
As a trusted authority, right? Is that what we're
Yeah,
talking about? A trusted
yeah.
authority of saying this is truth. This is true about this person or
Mm-hmm.
this document. Yeah.
It's more
It,
than this is truth about this document. It's more the truth of context, because they're not the one issuing the passport or whatever identification. They're issuing an assertion that it was done under the correct conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really interesting role.
Yeah.
yeah. I think that
Very-
beyond any specific technology, it's more of a sense that death is not an edge case, right? We tend to think of people as alive, as default, as users, right? When I was young, I'm old. When I was younger, the world population was like 5 billion or something. I had this conversation the other day with some young people who may be related to me. And they said, no, that's not five, it's eight. 8 billion people we're approaching now. Um, and the more people we have being born into the digital generation, the more likely the user we're serving may be deceased. And so, what does that mean for all the other standards we have cooking? What does it mean for governing AI that Dean talked about before, or what does it mean for how long we need to keep people on the roll? There's just a lot of questions that I think it almost touches a lot of these different standards as we begin to understand what it means to have an identity that's more fully digital, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's fascinating as well.
we often in identity talk about the concept of joiners, movers, leavers,
Ooh.
and I hate to say it, but we need to talk about joiners, movers, leavers, and dyers, or I don't know how better to say it, but I'm just, yeah,
They're
redefining
leaving
leaver.
really far and they're not coming back.
Yeah, they're definitely never going to boomerang
The
back into your
business,
employment.
as we call it. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, but we when I think about and talk about identity systems today, I try to always incorporate that into the thought because one of my first experiences in dealing with death professionally was actually when I was at Amazon, when I was working in retail infosec at Amazon, and it was Erin Crow who Erin was working at the customer service side of retail Amazon at the time, and she came to me and said, "What do I do when I have a customer who's died? How do I know that they've passed away? What do we do with their digital assets? What do we do with like their account, etc.?" And this was kind of an interesting topic. And obviously, Erin and I have since become friends, and she's gone off and done her own great things in the identity space. But this is a topic that we need to be talking about in every context where we're talking about human identities, whether it's from a consumer perspective, a government to citizen perspective, an employee perspective. Everybody dies, and it's just a reality that we have to incorporate like Heather said, into our threat models, but we also have to incorporate it into our planning for how do we deliver services, and then ultimately how do we unwind the services that we're delivering if we're an entity delivering services to, say, consumers.
It's a very distant, high level concept that's very metaphysical and at the same time has practical realities, right? Everyone has an opinion about death. And so thinking about those big issues is fascinating. But also, what about next Tuesday when something happens? Is the system prepared to handle certifying that someone is no longer around? You know, the classic DEF CON talk from 10 years ago, where there's someplace in the world where you could sign up to be a funeral director by filling out a simple form, and then you could create death certificates for people. And now they were dead. And if it's hard to certify death, it's infinitely harder to prove that you're physically alive in a digital identity system. So I think those things catching up are a growth edge for how we think through death and what those use cases actually turn into in those scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah, this touches on one more thing too, which I believe it was the folks at MOSIP who may have brought this up, which is, as much as we talk about death here, we also need to be able to track people who are alive. And I don't mean track like in a privacy invading kind of a way, but we need to be able to track like real births, because in the same I think it was the DEF CON presentation that you're referring to, Mike, around creating fake death certificates. They also could create fake birth certificates and create effectively humans out of whole cloth that don't really exist, and let them mature and take loans out in their name and do all these things, right? And so, as much as we're talking about tracking, death here and being able to transition assets, we also need to know who's actually alive. And these are generally government roles, and hopefully governments do that well. It does speak to our need to be able to assign and manage identities over a long period of time, that start when somebody's born and end sometime long after their natural death, because parts of that person, parts of their thoughts, their et cetera, still live on in this digital space.
That was the other thing that Mosa pointed out. We have a call out from them. They offered some interesting guidance in the document. And that is, the identity systems have to be capable of handling these, we'll call them state changes. And yet the rules for the state changes cannot be generated within the identity system. That it's really out of scope. The governments have to be coming up with the decision of who gets to issue death certificates, who gets to issue birth certificates, what are the regulations that surround this, and the identity systems have to be capable of responding to that. But we do have, thank heavens, we have some limit in our scope in terms of ultimately what we are responsible for.
We've been talking about death and the digital estate as if it's a binary on or off. Fair. But I think there's another whole set of cases that we'll need to think about as we go through this process, which is incapacitation. Right? It's what if they're kind of gone but not really gone? Like, and that brings us inevitably back to what a lot of the standards community has been working on for the last year and a half or so. And Heather talked about it earlier, which is the on behalf of vibe, right? How do you assign that? How do you take it away? So it's just another aspect of the same conversation that people in the real world are having to deal with.
Well, and I'll even add to that, Mike. It also impacts people who are victims of various disasters, and so if you lost your home in the Pacific Palisades fire earlier this year, I think it was, and you lost all of your digital data, all of your phone, your watch, your iPad, your whatever. If you lost all of that, how do you recover? One of the key recommendations is to have a password manager or credential manager, whatever you want to call it, but some kind of service to manage all of your credentials that you can recover from reliably if you need to, because it's not just useful for after you've passed away to hand those credentials over to your loved ones or whoever's going to take care of your digital estate, but it also helps in the case of incapacitation. It helps in the case of I've lost everything and now need to recover. I know that one reliable thing is there in the cloud somewhere. I just need to be able to get back into it, which has its own set of complications. But um, the implications of this work go beyond just death, and I think we need to embrace that and see how this can help in other scenarios too.
All right, so you have reached a period as of recording this talk. You have published this paper or are about to publish it for public review. Does somebody want to jump in and say what that means and what people should do about it?
We want your input. Did it make sense to you? Did it resonate with you? Do you think we missed something? Could we have expressed something a little bit differently? Like, all of that feedback is really useful to us. Once we get all the comments back, of course, and you may just be sending email, you may mark up a document, we're pretty flexible in how we receive comments. That will go through sort of the final iteration as Mike, Dean, and I figure out it's called the disposition of comments. How do we actually respond to each of these things? In some cases, we'll be like, okay, this is interesting, but it's kind of out of scope. In other cases, we'll be like, why didn't we think about that? Put it in the document. And then ultimately, we hope to get it published before the end of the calendar year.
So the call to action really is read it and let us know what you think and feedback. And the team here is going to do a lot of hard work to make sure that every comment is processed and responded to appropriately. So any final thoughts that you want to share before I stop recording?
Just one last thing. So while Heather, Mike, and I have written this white paper, the Death in the Digital State community group came together and wrote a planning guide for real humans to think about how do you plan for your own digital estate. Now, this is not legal advice. It should not be taken as legal advice. We are not lawyers. All of those things, all of the disclaimers aside, that paper is also under review right now. And once it is approved by the board, we will also release it in a public review period and go through much of the same process and disposition of comments, etc. So we hope you'll read that as well. That is really targeted toward your average everyday human, not necessarily identity nerds. Though we love our identity nerd friends, we realize not all of us are identity nerds. But it's targeted toward real humans, and I love your hearts there. That was great.
I didn't know it did that.
Yeah. So yeah, we look forward to your feedback on both papers and getting them out into a final form in a couple of weeks after we get the feedback from the public.
Great. So unless there's final thoughts from Mike and Heather, I will say thank you so much for your time today and your work on this important topic area. It really does resonate with people inside and outside of the identity community. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you, Heather and Mike.